So data is a fundamental element of computing, right? When I go back to the computing piece, I think that there's an element of abstraction, and they be able to process abstraction that if you can learn, no matter what your discipline, it would allow you to actually to cut through a lot of things.
Yes.
Because there are times when you could actually identify, here's what the problem really is. All the other elements that you're seeing there, okay, those are distractions.
All right, Sekou, welcome to the show. Appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great. So let's sort of begin with where you live currently and tell us a bit about what you're currently working on as well.
All right. So Sekou Remy, research scientist, working at IBM Research Africa. I live now in Nairobi, Kenya. And one can say basically I'm focused on machine learning applications. So basically to support decision making, evidence-based decisions, making this process of tackling how do you make a decision using all of these nice tools that people publish in conferences and papers, and making it actionable. That's really what my interest is.
Understood. And that's no easy feat, I imagine. Many variables probably to juggle.
It is not. So I was at NeurIPS. I think I ran into a guy, luminary in the field, name that everybody knows. And I was just talking about a reinforcement learning application. And he just paused. He was like, so you're actually doing this outside of the lab? Yeah. And I was like, yeah, it's tough. And he's like, I envy you. That's the dream. But the reality is the number of steps that you need to cross to be able to talk about an application. And we're not even there from my perspective, all the way there as yet. But there, even something as simple as who you can talk to, when you can talk to them, what are the parameters around those conversations. That's why it's so much easier to just go grab something and play a video game or play a board game, that kind of stuff.
Yes. Machine learning in production is going to be very interesting, especially as you're saying, when it comes to managing people's decisions, and those decisions have certain outcomes on people's lives. Great. Next question. Why did you choose to work where you work currently?
So for me, at the time that I made this move, I was actually looking for my position. At the time I was teaching, I enjoyed teaching. I still love teaching. And I will end up back in the classroom at some point in some capacity. But one of the things I just kept on asking was, okay, I feel as if I'm missing a piece of the education I need to have for my career. I was talking to one of my mentors at the time, and he was saying, okay, well, maybe you should consider a startup. And while you may not think of the job that I'm in as a startup, when I joined the lab, it was less than 5 years old. So in essence, it was still in that startup phase. So the lab was one of the first industrial research labs in Africa. So at the time it was, and it still is, very much on the frontier of the research enterprise. And at the time it was also growing. So it was an opportunity to see new things, try new things, experience new things. It also gave me a chance as a curious researcher to understand more about the call it the business of research, or the how exactly is it that research gets done. It's not just that somebody sits in a room and comes up with an amazing idea and then goes spend time and all of a sudden, quote, aha, research is here.
Okay.
There's a lot of infrastructure, a lot of moving pieces that has to be present for that research to be possible. Even just things like, okay, is the infrastructure there? Are the meeting spaces, or the pipelines, like the internet access, power, like all of these things that you don't normally think of, they have to be present for the scale of the things that people normally find as the interesting parts. But understanding the whole research enterprise, that was something that I was really curious about, because things don't just happen in a vacuum.
You said power. And,
Yeah.
and what kind of, really stuck out to me there is I don't, at least in my mind, don't necessarily think that that's a consideration. That's almost an assumption that you make in any, grand idea, but power. Okay.
Well, if you think about it, there's a whole, and I wouldn't say it's a new field. There's a domain of edge computing that exists right now. Power and network access are things that you cannot assume to be present continuously in an edge deployment. Well, what if you look at the more of the world where computers being pushed to the edge? Well, now you're really thinking about, you have to be judicious about power, and you have to be judicious about network bandwidth. So just because you can doesn't mean that you should stream the entire sensor payload. So you have to think about these things. But then there's also the other very practical piece. Coming from the Caribbean, one of the things that I had the experience, you do as well, there is such a thing as a power outage. What happens when there's a power outage? Well, certain things stop if it's not battery powered. So what happens if that power outage lasts more than 6 months? What happens to either the research enterprise? Yeah. What happens to the research enterprise if that were to happen? Now, 6 months may be extreme, but if you think about the contingencies and you think about what it would take to actually have research or have development or have some kind of business process in that extreme context, now you're really getting to distilling, okay, what is necessary and what needs to be done to ensure that the necessary can occur.
Yeah, and that probably has a lot of forward thinking, right? So any research idea that you probably bring into production is you're thinking maybe a decade out, anticipating how that infrastructure is going to serve more and more people at the edge, right?
Yeah, so Moore's law has been interesting. And there's been all this talk about, okay, well, now you can have more flops, or now you have more bandwidth of some kind. But then there's the other element of, okay, well, if your devices are smaller, then you can reduce your energy footprint as well. But normally when you reduce the energy footprint, you normally find applications to consume more energy. That's the existing approach. But if you start working with users and use cases that say, well, that's just not going to work, now you have to rethink things because maybe your users are now forcing you to think about things differently. And that's where I think real opportunities for innovation come, when people push back and say, well, that's nice, maybe if you were in the city, but if you're 6 hours out of the city and it takes, let's say, 8 hours sometimes to get a replacement part, how do you rethink this application? It's not just as easy as, oh, well, just do this, right? So there are whole industries. When you think of, there's a company called Zipline, for example, not in the AI data science domain yet, even though I think they might. They're all about using drones to deliver things of interest, maybe things like blood products, vaccines, those kind of things. It'd be interesting if somebody had to think about using something like Zipline to deliver a hard drive or deliver data, because there's some data and there's some, if you think about it in the US or in the West in general, there are times where it's actually easier and faster to literally transfer disks than it is. Trust me, it's when you look at data centers and the wild world of data centers, there's some interesting things there. But the point is, actually getting out of whether it's the lab or the classroom, asking people, learning about what they do, learning about what their constraints are, operating constraints, and also just in general, like what makes their job or their experience rough. It gives you a chance to actually understand, okay, well, here's something that I think I might be able to do that will help you either in some quantifiable way or help you in a way that you may not have known would transform your life. That's really the interesting piece. But you have to get out of your comfort zone because you don't know what other people's problems are. Yes,
understood. So we do the show to encourage people from the Caribbean region to pursue data-driven careers. And I'd like you to share with us your view of how you think machine learning, AI, whatever you want to call it, but more so the data-driven careers being you're gathering data or you're thinking about this new, no, I don't want to call it the new world that we live in, but everything is measured or everything is recorded to some degree. And how can you leverage that to either create new industries or be a part of a new industry?
Yeah. So this is something that, so at the time that I was in high school, at my high school, I was in the first class that had computer science and also the first class that had electrical engineering technology. In essence, think of it as very applied electrical engineering. There was also a lot of energy and buzz about this technology that was coming. There were some companies that was started at the time, and it was like, okay, all right, so we're getting a tech sector in the Caribbean. Okay, this is going to be awesome. Some of the things that were promised, I think, are still in the pipelines. Mm-hmm. It never came in the way that was envisioned, or at least my understanding of it. Again, I was a high schooler, so maybe I just didn't understand enough. But when you look at the kind of infrastructure that we have access to now, it really has been a transformative thing. When I'm having conversations with my parents who are, I'm hearing about my parents organizing Zoom meetings with people across the globe. Same thing, aunts, uncles, retirees in some cases. They're like, okay, they dove in headfirst into technology, and the infrastructure has been around to support. When I look at other sectors of the Caribbean, well, not just in Trinidad, I have a little bit of a purview of seeing what's happening in the rest of the Caribbean as well, but I don't think we're taking advantage of all that we could. Not in terms of, so people are using things in terms of keeping in touch with each other, which people in the Caribbean generally did anyway. The Caribbean, I think, has always been, or maybe not always, in my experience, the Caribbean has been very connected with the outside world. You always knew somebody who was somewhere and you heard something about them. Now, using technology, communication, locked, set. But the ability to actually look at the data-driven businesses, those I don't think we're a critical mass yet. We're not doing enough with data to help our own, in essence. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I would be curious to see, I don't know if anybody has already done this, how governments in the CARICOM sector are actually leveraging data beyond the, okay, do you have a website? Are your government officers providing information or services to the citizens via your website, etc.? Those kind of things. Like I've seen some cities globally like have a data.gov of some kind.
Right.
And there's a focus on data and a culture around looking at the data and having the population say, what can we do differently about data? I've just seen a few people. Many cases, there are those who may have gone abroad and come back home and start data-driven enterprises themselves. But it hasn't, I don't feel, admittedly, I don't see everything.
Right.
I don't feel that it has caught on enough for us.
Well, I think probably one interesting way to measure that is, how many data scientists and data analysts and data engineers are employed by the governments. That's, if they're technically not there, not to say that those functions don't necessarily exist in IT, but I think it would be kind of cool to, go to the government of Trinidad and Tobago or whichever particular island that you live in and look at a particular sector and see on LinkedIn if there's a data scientist that actually works for that division or a data engineer and whatnot. And I think that's a quite interesting measure, because without that, to some degree, they may or may not be doing things. That's not to say they're not necessarily farming out some CSV files and running some analysis with some static dashboards. But as you're saying, there's so much room for things that are almost automatic everywhere else in very mature data spaces to take advantage of.
So the broad question normally comes down to what's the motivation for doing anything? And it also applies here. So if you look at in the West, electronic health records are things that are widely used in hospital systems, they say. It's still not standardized, or that's a whole nother conversation. But the reason why it's there is actually not about health. It's not even about wellness. It's about billing and finance. So if you can't bill for the procedure, then there will be problems. And as a result, we have this whole infrastructure around data in health, which is really to support a billing function. What are these other opportunities for maybe unlikely motivation in education, in utilities, in even tourism, if you think about it, since it's a pretty important sector for the Caribbean. And what would be the motivation, right? So it even applies even to things like sports, right? If I'll pick on my own company for a bit, I'm a researcher at IBM Research, and one of the things that I've always been curious about is how is IBM associated with Wimbledon? Because you normally see like data and analytics associated with tennis, and I was like, why? Like, what's that about? Again, it's not just because, well, somebody sometimes probably thought it was cool, but there was more behind it. I am certain.
Right.
I am certain. I don't work in that group. I have nothing to do with that group. It's just something that I'm commenting on.
Yes.
But,
great. So before we sort of dive into your career journey, you shared with me some time back, and it stuck with me in terms of it's not only about investing in technology, right, but also making sure that people have access to it. And I think, given your experience living in Nairobi, making sure that that's correct.
That is correct.
How do you sort of see? I guess you probably really see it there, because I imagine the Caribbean infrastructure is slightly different to what is available there, and share some thoughts.
So there's a lot in that question. Let's actually start with this element of when people think of Nairobi from the Caribbean, it's definitely a world away in this time and day. It didn't always used to be like that. I was actually having a conversation with my dad recently, and he was talking about some of his classmates at UWI actually grew up in East Africa. Okay. There was a lot more engagement and interaction between the Caribbean and Africa then. So this notion of knowing what Nairobi is from a Caribbean context, it's something that we have to relearn. In cities here, honestly, I would say it feels a lot like home. Okay. The driving is probably on par, or at times probably neck and neck in general. But I would say it feels a lot like home. Granted, Nairobi is probably one of the most unique cities in that it's a country capital that has a national park within the city limits. So the concept of landing at the airport and seeing either zebras or giraffes, that's real. And there are lions in there, but you probably won't see them unless you're in the park. So some of those things are different. However, infrastructure-wise, there's a lot that we share in common. My mother is a pediatrician. She pretends to be retired, but she isn't very retired. And one of the things that she's talked about, she also trained in the UK. She talked about the kind of training that they had at the time. What kind of exposure, what kind of things were taught, what kind of things were common between, let's say, a country like Kenya and a country like Trinidad and Tobago. So many commonalities. Wow. So that's one of the pieces I would say. And since we're on the topic, it's probably colder in Nairobi year-round than it is in Port of Spain. People always think of Africa as this place where it's hot. But Africa is a very large continent that is extremely diverse. So that's one point. Being on the edge, in essence, exposure to technology, I think, is really where we were starting. I think I've gotten off track a little bit here. But the concept of being able to talk about who wants to apply technology and who is aware of what technology is out there is always a big one. Because, and I think the point that you're referring to is actually something that was said, and I'll paraphrase one of my mentors: you can make the most amazing technology on the planet, but if nobody uses it, it's useless.
Yes.
Right. So why might nobody use it? Well, maybe when you designed it, maybe you didn't think of something that might be a friction point that exists for, let's say, half of the people on the planet. Or maybe there's an element of awareness. I actually had a conversation with a collaborator last week when we were reviewing work that we had done over the previous quarter. And one of the things that she mentioned is like, she really appreciated learning about the technologies that she had access to. And I was like, well, yes, we're talking about some things that were provided through our university relations program. However, these things are out there. So I didn't only talk about what was available via university relations. I talked about things that I knew about. And she was like, I had no idea that these things were available. And in this case, she was actually talking about freely available. So we're talking about data science, machine learning courses, or even access to compute resources. So these things are there, but if you don't know that they're there, they don't exist.
Yes.
So that's really the piece that I was, it's a really big deal. And that concept, it's a really big deal for me personally. And that concept shows up in a few different ways, whether it comes to when you think about the people who could probably benefit most from a technology, chances are they don't even know that the technology exists. So that's
a nice little mind-boggling thought there. So I wanted to dive into your career journey. So can you give us a snapshot from high school up until where you are now, and then we'll dive into some specific moments.
Okay. All right. So I went to St. Mary's College High School. After high school, I spent maybe about 2 months at John D. Doing electrical engineering technology, and then actually started working at Royal Bank. So I was in the telecommunications department at Royal Bank. I basically made it clear to my family, I think I have a sense of what I'd like to study, but I don't know these fields. So I'd like to actually spend some time doing these things. So I was actually pretty happy when I got the chance to work at Royal, and got a sense of, so one of the questions I had before working at Royal is, do I want to do computer science or do I want to do electrical engineering? Well, turns out I ended up doing both because I could not decide. Well, it's actually a little bit deeper than that. I really do exist in the space in between the two fields. So that was actually a pretty cool opportunity for me. And while working at Royal, I got a chance to engage with people at TSTT and also people at IBM. So IBM came on the radar for me pretty early in my path. Then left Trinidad, went to Atlanta. I did both undergrad and grad in Atlanta, and then left Atlanta and did a postdoc at the University of Notre Dame. And then after that, went to South Carolina, came back down south. When I did that postdoc, one of the things I was trying to understand is what kind of job do I want? Academia is something that was interesting and important to me. And do I want to work in a large department, small department? Do I want to work in a college of engineering? Do I want to work in a college of computing? These are the kind of things that I was trying to tease out. So I had the opportunity to explore through this postdoc. And the postdoc also gave me a chance to have an experience living and working in the Midwest. I'd never had that experience previously. I always used to say that I can live anywhere that there's an airport. But the reality is when I picked my undergrad, institution, location was a very large part of it. I didn't want to go
Okay.
anywhere with hurricanes. I didn't want to
Come
go anywhere
on.
with earthquakes. I didn't want to go anywhere with too much snow. Yeah, so it ended up being we can talk a lot more about that.
It's a pretty
But
easy
with that,
optimization.
but the reality is, though, that while it may seem as if Atlanta was the only choice because of these exogenous parameters, there's also this notion that I became very well aware of within my first week at Morehouse. That's where I did one of my undergraduate degrees, that I was actually exactly in the place that I needed to be.
Okay.
So that was, as a first year student, that was actually something that was pretty profound for me to experience and know in my first week. Because I actually ran into a guy in the hallway. I was walking through a building, just trying to get myself acclimatized to this new place, new space. Just saw this guy, just said hi as I was walking. Turns out that he was somebody from Guyana. Turns out that he was the guy who ended up being my first physics teacher. I had no clue who he was. I just said hi. And that was actually one of those elements where it was like, okay, these things, they may seem accidental or seem like happenstance, but there were a few more of those moments that helped me recognize I was in the right place.
Great. And then I think you went to Clemson after that, and then you hopped on to IBM. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Beautiful.
So some from South Carolina to Nairobi. It was
That's a big change. I'm sure the food is quite different.
Very, very
so
different.
So tell us about what you were like in high school, and the reason why I tend to ask this question of people that we interview is we want to make sure that people are in high school now. There's the spectrum, right? The students that are very good. I am an example of a student who was quite horrible, just couldn't pay attention. I used to go to school with a pillow and sort of sleep the whole time. So I'm that guy. And I'm just curious as to how people were so disciplined when they were that young. So tell us what you were like in high school and what that experience was.
So I'd be really curious to know what my high school classmates would say, because I have no idea what they saw. So full disclosure, as a high schooler, I was actually also a competitive swimmer. Feels like a whole different lifetime. So
rigor,
sometimes
lots of discipline,
5-6 hours a day, sometimes 7 days a week. Yeah, so school was interesting because generally I would actually get to school after training in the morning. So there'd be times where literally first 2 periods, like I'm literally still sweating from that 5 a.m. start time workout. So I honestly am not sure exactly how I did it. So I know that I had parents that definitely valued education, and they supported me, but they also made it very clear that these things that I was studying in school are very different from what they knew. So they basically said, do your work.
Cracking the whips.
Yeah, they did. So the class that I would probably focus on in terms of an experience that was different from the rest was me in physics. Physics was something that I struggled with. I enjoyed. I would say I had pretty good teachers all the way through high school, specifically from 5 and 6. This concept of like, I should have done better. There was definitely more that I needed to do. So I would say if Miss Padanaban was around, she would probably have some really interesting things to say. Maybe she would say something like Sekou had potential, but needed to apply himself more. That's my guess.
Yeah, someone wrote that in my report card. Like, this dude is just wasting all his potential. So I have that in writing right now. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I have no idea what was in my report cards at this point. But I would say in general, I did okay. When it came to undergrad, there were things coming from the CXC, GC context, going to school in the US. And that first 2 years, there was a lot of overlap. So Calculus 1, Calculus 2, Calculus 3, because I did engineering and computer science. I was in a dual degree program. So there were things that I had exposure to that in some cases my classmates had not. So there were times, not very many, there were times where I actually got credit for classes because of A levels.
Yes.
So with that said, I was also, as I mentioned, in a dual degree. So I did computer science and electrical engineering as an undergrad, and it was done as a dual degree engineering program. I knew that I was going to go to Georgia Tech. Don't ask me. That's an even longer conversation. That was always on the cards.
Okay.
So I think in my dorm, my roommate told me once I was the guy that everybody knows that nobody sees. And it was largely because I was about that business.
Okay.
I took classes seriously, and I did the best that I could. I did fail classes, and I did repeat classes. Yeah. Both undergrad and grad. So just saying that it's a reality. When it comes down to it, for me, in hindsight, when I look back at those things, it largely was because I didn't put the right amount of resources into maximizing that class. So there was one class, one semester I did 22 credit hours, which was insane. I should not have done it. But with that said, that was one of the semesters that I ended up having to repeat the class. So I definitely put a lot of pressure on myself, but it was largely coming from a place of I had to do this. I also had a mindset of I wasn't going to quote bus. So even when I viewed things like repeating a class, that was not something that was a negative. When I took it again, it was now I have to shine this next time.
Yes.
Getting to graduation, getting to the completion of the in this case both degrees, that was not an option. It just had to be done.
So I wanted to pick out something there. So you're a researcher at IBM. You have your PhD from Georgia Tech. You did a postdoc in addition to you're an assistant professor. So you have all those things and you failed some classes because you were really pushing it. And I wanted to sort of repeat that particular component just because I think it's important. You were going for it. You hit the wall and then you picked yourself up and said, yeah, I still need to go achieve all this. And you were gunning for it. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, definitely. It was not the easiest of paths. That
I can imagine.
By no stretch. But fortunately, I had friends and family around to support and help. But yeah, the drive was definitely there, though. So one of the other elements in terms of making a decision about what to do, as I mentioned, was a competitive swimmer. One of the questions was, okay, are you going to remain a student athlete? Like, is that something that you want to pursue? And I'd actually made the decision that if I'm going to go to school and my goal was to get a scholarship, my reason is that I will be paid to be a student as opposed to be paid to be an athlete.
Right.
So that was the piece for me. So it was all guns blazing as far as that goes.
That I have an immense amount of respect there. I wish I had that amount of drive in my undergrad. I think the only thing in the back of my mind was if I went home to my father and said, yeah, I spent all your money and it didn't work out, I would be dead. So that was my motivation to finish. And kind of the reason I bring that up is, at least for the students out there that maybe don't resonate as much with school or that particular form of learning. Whereas what I'm admiring about your story is even when you were in high school, you felt your affinities or you felt you were intuitive enough to say, I kind of like this, and you're very curious, and you even took even measured steps to get work experience before you went to college, which kudos to you there. And it seems like that's a common thread. Even you coming in, making that decision to go to IBM Research, it was very thought out, and you're like, I still haven't found my position yet. And I found those words to be quite critical, I would say.
Yeah, they're definitely... There is a bit of thought that goes into it. Some of it also just comes from taking advantages of opportunities that present themselves, because there are things that you don't know are there. Again, back to this awareness piece. I didn't know at the time, like when I was in high school, I didn't know that you could do a dual degree in engineering. In my case, it was computer science and electrical engineering. I didn't know it was a possibility. I thought I had to pick. So awareness, and then taking advantage of the opportunities when they come. Being ready for them is definitely something. But I think to go back to something else you said, this question about what motivates people, if you don't find something that motivates you, it's probably going to be difficult to do these things. I had classmates, or even myself, there were times when I found myself going through the motion because I didn't know what my why was. Like, why am I doing this? Well, you can only do things for so long when the answer is somebody else wants me to do it.
Yeah.
Right. There's a point at which you have to say, what is it that I want to do? And making sure that you understand as much as you can about why you want to do it. Because when it gets hard, it's really just you. Even if you have people that are supporting you or people who will crack the whip at some point in time, especially if you were to think about going away to go to school, 3:00 in the morning on a Saturday, and you have an exam on Monday, who's going to actually wake you up?
Yep.
Right. So that concept of finding your why is important, and it does take time, but it's worth it. Because if you're doing things for the wrong reasons, you might end up either hating what you're doing, or you might end up missing the opportunity that's for you.
That makes a lot of sense. One thing I wanted to ask your opinion on computer science, I think as I reflect on my own education, I wish I had done computer science probably from day one. Not necessarily to say that, well, I'm in love with computer science, but more so from the freedom a degree like that gives you, or let's call it software engineering. I did chemical engineering and systems engineering. Okay, so chemical engineering, I decided I do not want to be in a lab, and that gave me no freedom whatsoever. So that was a learning experience. And for me, the reason I chose that was I didn't know what the heck I wanted to do. I figured out that they made the most amount of money, and Trinidad had oil. I'm like, okay, I'll just go do this. Worst case scenario. So that was my thinking. Absolutely polar opposite to yours, which I think is very good for people to see a spectrum on the show. But in addition to that, as I've become a data scientist now, working for one of the top companies, and I get to see top computer scientists and the things that they make, right? And this ability to not need permission to create a product. I don't need much resources to create a digital product. And I find that very liberating to some degree. Yeah. And I think it's a good skill to have, even if you're not, I would say, considering yourself to be a hardcore computer scientist. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself to be one, but being exposed to that particular field, I think, prepares you very well for the future that's coming, to speak to machines.
So one of the things that I can say, and I'm answering your question, one of the things that I can say that I enjoyed about the US style of education is that you're forced to do what they consider. In my case, I went to a liberal arts undergrad as for the first part of my degree. You're forced to do, quote, the humanities. And in essence, you have all of these courses that may have nothing to do with your major. What I found really awesome about that experience actually links back. I had chalk dust as a teacher, and I did English literature and language. And like, I'll never forget the concept of Macbeth. And I'm like, okay, why does Macbeth matter? And I'll never forget, there's one element there's one day, I should say, where he called somebody an educated fool. And he in that rant, he was talking about actually the role of education and how important it was not just to know this thing if you cared about sciences or whatever, but to have these other skills. What I'm finding interesting, and I think what you're tapping into this, is that computing is now one of those things. Yes. Just as it was important to do literature, language, even if you're in the sciences, it's important to actually have not necessarily computer science, but computational thinking as a critical element. For some, computer science will be of value, and I think you're one in those ways. But at the core, it's the ability to process abstraction, the ability to actually then compound those abstractions. That's where you get this value that you're talking about. You don't need a lot of startup capital, in essence, to deploy an app or to develop a digital solution. But all of that is actually based on understanding computing, which is not computer science. It's a part of it. It's a component of it.
Yep.
And you talked about process engineering. I think as a chemical engineer, you'd have to have had an element of process engineering.
Absolutely.
I actually was an electrical engineer, and I wish that I had learned more about process engineering because I was on the system side. That was my interest. That was my focus. And there's so many things that can be borrowed. So I hope that you're able to actually leverage things that you learned in that part of your training. And if you haven't done it yet, I hope that you're able to leverage it in the future.
Yeah, I think one of the things what's interesting there is I know a number of people who have done chemical engineering who have swapped over into data science. And one of the things, as you get quiet sometimes, and you think about how does someone produce a chemical product from raw materials? It goes through several stages, and then you eventually do some processing and you get this final product. And there are many interaction effects that you have to consider and all those things coming back to chemistry. And I find data science, the perfect match for that in terms of I have different types of data, different types of hardware processing it. If I run this particular algorithm, it might have some weird side effects on my data. And can I get the ultimate, final product that I need within some bounded error, right? So that it won't kill somebody, or, if I'm making a tablet or whatever the case may be, right?
Right.
So that definitely, I think at different times has given me a deeper appreciation as to when I'm looking at data on my screen, it's literally looking at it, hey, this might just be a chemical compound that if I add these two things together, they don't mix, right? For instance, like a numerical and a string, they don't necessarily mix. You have to find some other way or some other transformation to actually get them to mix. So that's, thanks for bringing that up there. And I think to round off that particular part of the discussion, even people who are, let's say, in sales, right? I believe that sales is becoming, many companies are now going to have this more technical component. Now let's call it this machine learning component, this AI thing, right? Every company to some degree will come out with some type of AI spin. And I think the more that you understand the computing side, the data side, or just in general, why does that particular approach work and its real benefits, but also in addition to its real limitations, I think you can better communicate value of someone's product, let's say, that's infused with machine learning and all that fun stuff. So
I think at the root of what you're saying, though, is that because, and this sometimes is a curse, it's a blessing, but it's sometimes a curse. The fact that you have the data means that you actually now can do some type of analysis on that data and then come up with some finding. It now provides something tangible, something concrete. And if you are measuring it, then you have the ability to work on changing it or controlling it, etc. And that concept touches just about every profession. But I think the broader thing, and this is why I go back to the computing piece, So data is a fundamental element of computing, right? When I go back to the computing piece, I think that there's an element of abstraction, and they be able to process abstraction that if you can learn, no matter what your discipline, it would allow you to actually to cut through a lot of things.
Yes.
Because there are times when you could actually identify, here's what the problem really is. All the other elements that you're seeing there, okay, those are distractions.
Mm-hmm.
This is exactly the problem, and it looks exactly like that, but it's just with
Layered
dressing on
different.
it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the concept that I feel beyond. And then, I mean, when you look at data, that's just the distilled form of it. Now you're just saying, oh, it's a pandas data frame. Okay, well, it's a pandas data frame that happens to have the features that relate to a specific problem. But if you understand how to do something with pandas, then it doesn't matter what the features are, or it doesn't matter what the algorithm that you're trying to apply is. So that's what I think we're driving at that. So anybody listening, doesn't matter what you do, computation is important. It would add value to your life. Data is the realization of that.
Yes, absolutely. So you'll remember that before you go to bed. So I wanted to jump in the next piece of your career journey. You are one of those. I had an interview with Dr. Anil Kokaram, and I said, hey, people who do PhDs are crazy. But he made a comment that you might actually be weird to do a PhD. And I found that quite insightful coming from someone as well accomplished as him. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. In terms of being crazy, or, what does it take, but also, what's the mindset to do one?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer of what the mindset is. But if it is something like, for example, research is something that I was always intrigued by.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did research as a first year all the way through my undergrad experience. And then as a grad student, nice. I mentored undergrads through the research because I understood how important research was to what I was doing in the classroom. The classroom is nice, yeah, teachers give you homework, but normally I don't have a motivation for why that is relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Research was the opportunity for me to actually understand, oh, this is why you care about calculus. Or this is why you care about linear algebra. Or this is why you care about operating systems. When it comes down to it, research allowed you to get closer to a real problem. And you're like, okay, well, I've learned this. This is what the textbook says. And now I've come to the end of the knowledge. What do I do? That for me is where this whole trip through grad school came. And I think you pointed this out. Yeah, I have been curious for a really long time. I have an uncle that reminded me on the day that I graduated from Morehouse that I was the kid that always asked too many damn questions. But I wanted to understand. I wanted to know. So for me, that's probably the basis of how I ended up in this profession of research. And for me, a PhD allowed me the opportunity to learn how to do research in a particular construct. There are many PhD journeys. There is definitely not one. And even I think some people talk about, oh, if you do a PhD in Europe, it only takes 3 years, blah, 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 blah. There is no one path, right? But with that said, the question that I think everybody should consider is what's the path for them?
Yeah.
And what is it that they would like? So, for example, when I was looking at grad schools, I actually stayed at Georgia Tech to do my PhD after I'd finished the second part of my bachelor's. But the reason I stayed at Georgia Tech is that there were 10 different research groups that were doing things that were of interest to me, all in one department.
That's cool.
So it was. It's a large engineering program, so those kind of things would happen. And the environment, the culture, the school context was actually viable for me. It didn't mean that it was easy. It was extremely hard to be a grad student at Georgia Tech.
Yes.
But when that decision was made, it was something that I was like, okay, I think I can do this. Yeah.
I wonder about that. I think I can do this. How that? So you had that at the beginning, like, I think I can do this.
Yeah, I did.
Good. Yeah, cool. I think when I started mine, I was just like, I have no clue if I'm going to be able to get through this, just because it was. And I'm bringing this story up simply because when people listen to it, I do bring up PhD a lot, and my intention is to not say, hey, you have to do a PhD, but it's also to lay out the land in terms of if you're taking, let's say, a research career path, it seems like having a PhD is almost a must to some degree. So I'd like to maybe get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a must. I think having a PhD definitely opens some research doors that would be harder to open, but not impossible if you didn't have one. But what I view a PhD as is an opportunity for you to demonstrate that you could understand the system and make it through. It doesn't mean that you're the smartest person in the world. It literally just means that you're able to understand the system well enough to be able to check the boxes to get to the conclusion of that process. There's some really bright people that I know that decided that they didn't want to do it. Like at the time I was at Tech, there was another guy who was in the graduate program whose goal was to take every class in the department. That guy actually, I mean, he was deep from the Caribbean as well, really smart, but his thing was knowledge.
I see.
Right?
Yes.
There are others who are saying, well, if I do a master's, I'll get this bump. If I do a PhD, I'll get this bump. So that's why I want to do it.
Right.
And for some of them, that worked.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of them.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, I think it's really about just understanding what is it that motivates you. And again, if you were, I mean, we don't have the ability to do this time loop thing. Thank you, Marvel, for putting this in our minds. We don't have the ability to live through time loops. But even if you were to do it again, like if I were to do it again, I'm certain that our paths would be different, even if we were in the same department in our schools, because things are different. It doesn't take much to have a completely different trajectory.
Yeah, that is a good. Yeah, I like that you brought that up, just because you have no idea how things are gonna sort of unroll in your future to get particular opportunities. And I think the last question I had around your PhD experience, I think that experience puts you, it really tests your commitment to certain things. And what lessons can you suss out of that experience that any listener can maybe benefit from?
So I'm thinking back to my days at, so one of the things I used to do is there's a program called Focus, which prospective grad students would come to Atlanta, check out Georgia Tech. And I was a supporter of Focus from the standpoint as a grad student. I did my best to be present. But one of the pieces of advice that still resonates with me, that when I shared it, like people just look at you like, what do you mean? I would view the relationship, in essence, when you're getting into a graduate program, you're actually getting into multiple relationships. One is the relationship with the institution. Mm-hmm. Another is a relationship with your advisor, the person. Maybe the advisor is not the same advisor that you actually graduate with. That's a different story. And then there's a relationship that you have with your research group, which is actually a little bit distinct from the one that you have with your advisor. So, and I view each of those as a marriage, because once you graduate, for example, you will forever be linked with your advisor.
Yes.
Forever. Right? So this is a long-term relationship that you are entering. So I use the word marriage. This concept of you don't just enter into that kind of relationship lightly. Mm-hmm. And I would say the same for finding your advisor or finding your program, because these are things that in the experience of it, they're going to have implications because let's say some people have great advisors, other people don't. Some people have great research groups that are collaborative, other people's don't. But it's probably worth it to actually do what you can to scout and understand what's the culture, what's the context, what's it like. You find out from people, okay, do people generally tend to come to the lab early, talking to your prospective lab mates? What's the like, is there an end of year potluck? Like those kind of questions, like in my case, I was a very active part of the Black Graduate Research, the Black Graduate Student Organization. And like that played a very large role in my ability to make it through the trials that was Georgia Tech at the graduate level. Like these are people that I still call today. Or whenever I'm passing through Atlanta, I try to do what I can to find them. Like that notion of being able to say, who is your family? Because you will need many different types of families. I had, I want to say, 3 different advisors through my graduate journey. Some cases people left, some cases like just new opportunities came up, trying to figure out what's the best fit. But one of the things that I can say is that relationship is critical to being able to make it through. Also, I should say those relationships are critical to being able to make it through.
Yeah, that's a very, very strong point. And I think that even extends to most things that you end up doing, right? The relationships that you have all around you will tend to sort of project some of the success that you might be able to have in the future, or the different perspectives that you can essentially draw on. And I wanted to stick one in there in terms of going through a PhD, you learn a lot about editing. And there was a quote that I read that said, the key to finishing is to stick through all the edits. And that had remained with me because, even when you finish school, there's a project that you're working on and there's so many revisions that you have to go through. And you just kind of you learn to set such a high threshold for redoing work and iterating and continuously banging on a problem that you're able to sort of succeed there. So for folks that are listening, if you have to write a long document or working on a long project and there are many different revisions to the project, keep going, I would say, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Postdoc. I chose not to do one simply because I was like, I want to go get paid, and that's I'm claiming that as my blanket assumption that postdocs don't get paid as well as, let's say, people who go to work. But I think for me, I may have not been as married to my research topic as maybe other people were, or just purely embedded in the field of research. So I wanted to get your thoughts on why you did a postdoc.
So first, I would say that postdocs can get paid really nicely.
Cool.
I have to say that I enjoyed my opportunity to cash a check that I did receive. The other piece of that same statement or that same equation is that where you live matters. So, for example, if I were to be a postdoc at a university in Washington, D.C., getting paid what I was getting in South Bend, Indiana, I probably would have struggled.
Right.
But
that makes sense.
So these are things that you have to think about when you're considering that equation. The same would also apply to being a graduate student. So some people don't know this when they're thinking about the equation as undergrads, but in many cases, you can actually get paid comfortably to pursue your graduate studies. You just have to find the opportunity that actually is best for you. And it does take some time. So, so the same thing I would say would apply to postdocs. So there were some postdocs that I knew who were making half of what I was. There were postdocs that I knew that were making twice what I was.
Wow.
But yeah, so there's a spectrum there. For me, the postdoc gave me the opportunity to actually pivot into a new area, an area that I was curious about. And for me, it was service-oriented computing. And as a grad student, my focus was on getting out and at the time I was finishing, there was this concept of, well, my dissertation was focused on learning from examples. So in essence, robots learning from human teachers, by example, in the same way that a teacher would teach human students. One of the things that became, as an electrical and computer engineer, aka I'm an ECE, you have to deal with hardware. One of the problems with hardware is that hardware doesn't always think about your timelines and doesn't always allow you to, specifically in robotics, it's sometimes the hardware can be as big of a fight as the theory. So one of the things I was curious about for that concept that I was exploring to scale was how service-oriented computing, and for me, it was the beginning of my journey to cloud, could actually be leveraged to support the scale to do the research I was interested in at the time. So that's where the postdoc was for me. It gave me a chance to do that. At the time, I was able to work with somebody who was pretty solid in that service-oriented space. And also I had a co-advisor who was in the, so I was basically jointly advised between somebody in computer science and engineering and somebody in mechanical engineering, or aerospace and mechanical.
Oh, cool.
So I was in the middle of a really long corridor with two advisors on each end, literally on each end. But if you notice again, there's the and. So it's robotics and service-oriented computing and two different departments. But I liked, and this is one of the other elements of the postdoc for me as well, to get a chance to see, okay, well, what kind of department might I like? And I realized I wanted, if I was going to be in a computer science department, it needed to be within a college of engineering.
Okay.
So that was one of the things that the postdoc helped me suss out.
It's quite interesting that you went to such great detail. At least when I was applying for academic jobs, well, I guess naturally any person applying for academic jobs, whoever gives you an opportunity, but thinking to the degree of what department it's in addition to some of the other things that, what college, that's quite interesting. And I did not necessarily think about that too much in terms of you were just going for a particular title and you're just playing that game, I guess, right?
There's even an element of did the computer science department come out of electrical engineering or did it come out of math? Because if it did, the culture and the nature of the department, radically different. Radically different. So there's even elements like that. It also, for me, it probably was easy to spot by looking at the types of courses that were offered and had historically been offered. So if there were things that resonated with me, it likely was, and that's what I noticed, there was likely because it was a computer science department in a college of engineering or a computer engineering department.
That makes sense. And now you finished your postdoc and you decided you've gotten an opportunity to go to Clemson University. Tell us what that was like and what hypothesis were you trying to approve or disapprove in that move? Because it seems like each different move that you make, there's something that you're going to test and then you go get an update essentially on that hypothesis.
So at that time, I was actually just living the life of a faculty member.
Okay.
So I think I'd already convinced myself that academia was something that I loved, and I enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed research. The element of being able to do it at Clemson was also pretty interesting because there was a really large emphasis of computing that was outside of the College of Engineering. So the campus IT infrastructure was really amazing. There were data centers in the state of South Carolina that were in essence hosted at Clemson. So there was a lot of computing infrastructure that was just down the street. So like I used to do rides on afternoons. So there would be times when I could ride by this pretty large data center.
Wow.
But yeah, so it was unreasonably nice resources.
That's pretty cool. I have probably the opposite reason why I wanted to go into academia. is because I used to take a lot of naps in my lab, and my advisor was just like, if you go to a real job, you'll be dead. So I was like, okay, I need to go to academia so I can take a nap. That was one of my, I just love the freedom of academia. I thought that was cool, where you can really explore, you go to classes, and I think it spoke to a lot of being able to learn a lot, right?
So I did my first internship, corporate internship, at Boeing in their applied research and technology department. Okay. It's still, in essence, for me, it was still within computing. And I got to realize at that point in time that there were, from a corporate research perspective, there were certain places that I think I would be okay. And I got that by just having that internship experience. So I would say to anybody listening, take the opportunities to have internships in as broad a setting as possible. Get to know people, not just at the place that you're doing the internship, but even other places around. And also talk to your mentors about where to do internships as well, because I think many of the opportunities that I had were amazing because of the people who introduced me to them.
I see.
And that even applies to this job today. But yeah, this there's so much that you could be exposed to. There's so much that's there. But when it comes down to it, it really has to be, you have to link it back to you and your journey. And then you also have to be intentional about taking that experience, good, bad, or indifferent, and turning it into something that impacts your future. So even the bad experiences, the classes failed or the wrong turns, as one may say. And I think I'll jump ahead because I know I've been watching your podcast. So I know one of the questions you're going to ask is about books.
Yes.
Frank Herbert's Dune. Have you ever read Dune?
I have it on my shelf, and I just, it starts off very thick.
Before that movie comes out.
Okay.
Right? I think we're getting it finally sometime this year. Read it before the movie comes out. But that was one of the books that I had a chance to read pretty young. And it was transformative from the standpoint of understanding the decisions and the impact decisions can have on the future. And this notion, I was, again, in high school dealing with this notion of like fate and future and, okay, how do you get to this thing that you would like to get to? Yes. Again, all of that started with Dune.
I wish I had read that a long time ago then, because I probably wouldn't have been freaking out as much. Great. So you're a professor. Things are going well. What were you like as a professor? Were you you come into class and you're cracking whips? And the reason why I actually maybe say that you were probably cracking whips is because when I meet students now, I know how slack of a student I was. And when I identify students that, they're just like, yeah, whatever, but they have a lot of potential, you do your best to crack the whip to make sure that, they make that good decision that will lead to something great later on. So what was your sort of philosophy as a professor?
My mindset is that anyone can engage in content. The question is trying to find what is it that resonates with you. Okay. So I actually started teaching before my postdoc. In the postdoc, I had the chance to teach, and then as a faculty member at Clemson. But the general question for me is trying to find ways to bring whatever is outside the classroom in.
Yeah. So
that if we're doing a networking class, I want to actually bring a real world application into the classroom. Yes. Because the textbook is one thing, and I know that my students hated reading the textbook. It's a necessary evil. Mm-hmm. You can't learn everything from me. And that was one of the LMs. I know that they hated it. They were like, yeah, okay, you're the teacher. You're supposed to teach me everything. That's why we're paying you. I'm like, that's not quite how it works. I get what you're saying, but I can't. Yeah. But I used to bring in things from outside of the classroom. I think the first time I taught an intro to CS class, I was bringing in like little vignettes from, you've seen the movie Groundhog Day?
I believe so, yeah, a while back.
Yeah, I brought this into the class. Students are looking at me like, is this a movie from the 80s? But the concept of fishing was something that I was able to explain by showing Groundhog Day.
I see.
So now you had this experience of, oh, there's this thing in the textbook, I'm learning a definition, but I'm connecting it to something that I've actually seen play out.
Yes.
For me, that's the approach that I try. When I was teaching a junior level networking class, one of the things that I did is that I brought robotics into that classroom. And of course, there was some grumbling like, okay, this is networking. Why is he talking about robotics? But for me, it's like, okay, well, the robot, you can just treat it as a web server. And everything that we're talking about from a networking perspective, it just happens to be making a robot move. Why is this any different?
Yeah.
So for me, that gave me the opportunity to reuse some things that I was doing for other work, abstraction, reuse, very critical.
Yes.
But the thing that I actually liked most about that experience was it allowed students to be in a shared space without having to physically be in the same shared space. So what ended up happening was there were cases where students were saying, and this is direct feedback from students, saying, I was really frustrated that I couldn't solve the problem. And then I saw somebody else's robot moving. So I knew that they had solved the problem.
Wow.
So then it meant that I could solve it too. And I was like, I didn't plan it like that, but if anybody asked, yeah, that was my intention. For me, the robot is an objective third party. And in this case, now we're talking of a networking context. I would like you to demonstrate what you've learned in networking. And if you have done, exactly. So for me, it's bridging domains. It's, you have something in you. You have some experience. Let's link that to something else that you don't necessarily know. That's one dimension. And then there's the other dimension of, if I give you everything, you're probably not going to remember anything.
Yes.
So I will give you something that isn't necessarily covered in class because I'd like you to have a discussion. Chances are it's not as far away from what you know than you think.
And stretching your mind to actually, because it'll just be masked differently when you go to work. That same problem would exist, and it just, like you're saying, it's dressed differently, but it's the same thing you kind of saw before. And then you have to have the abstraction, be able to abstract to see what it really is that you're looking at.
It didn't always win me friends in the classroom. There were some students that hated that experience. However, it was definitely worth it when I was able to see people say, okay, I didn't understand it before, but I had enough cases that actually made me feel okay about doing it, where they came back and was like, okay, I didn't like you, but I got it. Yeah.
Yes. Cool. And for those that are listening, at least one thing that I'm very passionate about and making sure that people continue to give back. So for instance, you do a bachelor's, you do a master's, whatever it is that you do, you're a working professional. Definitely make sure to reach back and give someone that context as to, hey, all this crap you're studying in school, it is useful. Some of it is not, and that's the game. But I also think that's an important lesson too. Like, there's just shit in life that you have to deal with, and that's okay. That's your shit you have to deal with. Great. So I want to move on to you becoming a research scientist and a technical lead at IBM Research. IBM Research, in my mind, that's no joke. That's a pretty serious place. And you decided to go to Nairobi. What have you seen in the healthcare space at IBM Research? Right, healthcare is very big right now. And what would you say did you have a big healthcare background before you went into that sort of domain, or you pretty much went into it with your strong computing background?
Yeah, it's that question has layers. So, as I mentioned, did computer science in high school, both O's and A's. I did CS, and both of the projects that I did at each of those levels were actually had a healthcare theme to it.
Interesting.
And basically was digitizing of health records or something along that line. Both of my parents are or were health professionals.
Okay.
And there were many times they were like, "Oh, don't you want to do medicine?" And I was like, "No. You all have too many multi-syllable words. That's not for me." However, it was ironic that healthcare became one of the areas for me to actually address a question that I was interested in. I was previously focused on the question with robotics, but healthcare is a new domain. The question is, we have all of these technologies, AI, machine learning, we have cloud computing, we have whether it's containerization, all of these things. But at the end of the day, who is using them and what are they using them for? And it's largely that I think the opportunities to, and I think I mentioned this earlier in this conversation, many of the people who could use or could benefit from a technology aren't able to. And I see that in healthcare. So when I interviewed for the position, I actually thought I was going to be doing something much more closer to systems or infrastructure on the networking side. But that's the nature of corporate research. There are times when strategy shifts and surprise, first day of work, you're now working on a healthcare team. But I think the seeds for it were set a long time ago. So it's some of my earlier projects, in essence, were applying machine learning or specifically reinforcement in a healthcare context. So while I was doing it before with a robot, now it's a model of some kind of epidemiological context.
I see. And I like the fact that you brought up there's a theme that I wanted to make sure that was sort of very clear in terms of it's not only about the technology that you're working on, it's about the people actually being able to use it and getting access to it as well. So, and the other story or piece of the story that I thought was kind of cool was you had kind of seen IBM back when you were a teenager at Royal Bank, I believe. So, coming all those years later, I thought was kind of cool as well. And what I wanted to find out from you is what should listeners know about what it takes to succeed as an industry researcher versus, I'm going to call it an academic-based researcher, not to knock it down a notch or anything like that. I think they're just slightly different domains or slightly different objective functions that you're optimizing towards. Yeah,
so they are different, but at the core, it really just depends on where you are. Like where you're located. So, for example, I'm at a specific type of industry research lab, and I have colleagues at other places that have radically different experiences.
Okay.
As in their day-to-day jobs. But at the core of it, there's an element that I think is unique to research and the research enterprise. And it's that you are, in essence, you're a startup, you're a small business. Whether you're in industry or in academia. This became clear to me first in academia, in essence, when I was starting a new lab. There's this concept of having startup funds, and then I'll be hiring grad students and undergrads. In essence, there is this, it's a business. It's a business within the context of a larger business. But if you think of the university or the department or the college, depending on how big your university is, in essence, they are collaborating. So maybe you can think of it as your office space is just rented space, and maybe there are shared resources like printing, or shared resources like grants, like you have a grants office. So there's an element of thinking of being a researcher as a startup, and the reason I say a startup is normally if you're thinking of you're starting a new position at a new institution, all of the things that you'd have to do as a small business starting up for the first time in industry, you'd actually have to do this in academia as well. It may not seem like that, but that is the reality. The nature in general about the difference between corporate research and academic research is that when you think of strategy, your strategy in a corporate context is probably going to come from somewhere within the company. As opposed to if you were an academic researcher, you have a little bit more leeway. However, your strategy is influenced by your opportunities for funding.
Yeah.
Right. So whether it's what the NSF program manager in your division, what they think is important, and that person may be in existence for 3 years, and then somebody else comes and now there's a new focus, which is influenced by the field. But in essence, now your structure and what you do is influenced by a different organization, a different type of structure. So that's one of the areas of differentiation. There's another that I can think about. People normally say, okay, you do corporate research, or you don't have to worry about grant funding. Well, it just depends on what kind of organization you work in. So we go after grant funding. It's one way that we actually fund some of the work that we do. And it just depends on what your context is. There are researchers in my company who have never gone after grant funding. There's some who almost live like bread and butter is government contracts or grants. So it really just depends on you as a researcher, what your context is and what your ecosystem looks like. Because so I have colleagues who work in the EU, and there's a lot more grant funding for the kind of work that we would do if we were in the EU than there is here. So it's really just about understanding again, it goes back to what's the business and what's the dollars and cents of how research gets done. You have to understand that. And money is one of them.
Great. So as we get a little closer to the end, I wanted to jump into the Caribbean and Africa, since you're from the Caribbean, but you're living there and sort of melding those two cultures. What should listeners understand about Africa? And, yes, I'm generalizing from Nairobi to Africa, if anyone's freaking out, and the future.
So the first, I have to echo this statement that Africa is a very large continent, 1.4 billion people. I think on the order of 1,500 languages spoken. Order of magnitude. Still a lot, right? So there's a lot of diversity. So the concept of plurality is something that is very common here. So for example, in Kenya, it's common for people to speak 3 or 4 languages to some degree. Right? They may have the language that they grew up speaking, but then there's the language that they learned in schools. And then maybe depending on where they are, they may know a language that is common, either to deal with trade or just because history. This plurality is something that means that there's an opportunity for people to think differently. And that's something that I think is critical for others to understand. There are assumptions that people make, and you sometimes see it in the way that helicopter research is sometimes done in Africa, where people are coming, landing, doing research, and then making assumptions that are not grounded in reality, and then going off and either writing a paper or thinking that they have solved something that's not yet solved. But with that said, there is a very rich and energetic community that's looking for collaboration. So if you're interested in building bridges, there are people here who are very willing and open to you coming. You just have to understand who you're engaging in what context. There's another element of there's a general narrative of, well, not just Africa, but many places in the global south, of a narrative of like a deficit narrative.
Yes.
And I would say that that's a really problematic one. While things aren't always perfect, there is definitely, or there should not be, a deficit narrative. What I would generally say is that there are opportunities for systems and processes to improve. And there's also opportunities for, when you think about benchmarking. So maybe benchmarking could actually make things appear more consistent with what one might expect. But with that said, just because you expect it doesn't mean that it's the best.
Right.
So the stories that people always talk about when you think about development in Africa is cell phones and mobile money and transactions, payment transactions. So Africa in financial technology has led the way in terms of there was mobile money transactions here long before it was common in other places.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
And when it comes down to it, the question is why? And it really came down to understanding what the context was, understanding what people's needs were. And innovation here was able to basically ask questions like, okay, well, if we can do it here, why can't we do it anywhere? Right. So there's an element of that. But I think the broader or the more fundamental pieces, there are some really interesting problems that can be solved if you think differently. And sometimes it's easier to think differently if you're not in the box.
Yes.
If you're not in the place where everybody is saying, this is what we do and this is how we do it. You have the opportunity to ask questions. You also have the opportunity to say, here is what has been done previously. Would this work? And if so, why should it work? And are there other ways to do things? Taking into strong consideration the expertise that exists here. And there's times when people don't. They just assume that the expertise is not here. But I'm here to tell you that it's here.
Wow, that's strong. Good words, and definitely ones I've stuck in my pocket and will be considering. So the last segment of the podcast, now that we've kind of dove deep into your career journey, are you giving us a very strong perspective on, yes, I'm generalizing to Africa, but more specifically, let's say Nairobi, in your experience there. You're very passionate about your field, and I guess passionate in general, but also very curious. What advice would you give around cultivating that type of passion as you sort of go along in your career?
I think if you're a student, taking the opportunity to, whether it's internships or sometimes they consider them externships, I think opportunities to actually get practical experience, not just learning about technologies, but learning about people. There's another element. If you have a chance to do research, at least, especially if you're an undergrad, at least do it once. At least once.
Yeah.
It allows you to, one, build relationships with your faculty in ways that go beyond the normal, can I get an A? Right? But also it allows you to actually understand this notion of, oh, there are questions that people don't have answers to. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Or, wow, that question was something that people didn't know already, and it's in a textbook. Okay, how do it come to be in the textbook? The other element I would say is, if you can travel, do so. Doesn't have to be travel far, but get away from the place that is normal, the place that is comfortable. Right. So that's the if you can go far, then go far. But you don't have to go very far to be in a different place.
That was a good one. And you've kind of spoken to maybe the high schooler and the college student. What would you say to a professional in terms of what advice would you give a professional? to advance their career. You're at one of the top research labs in the world. You're on the frontier, so there are many problems that are not solved. And I think maybe in terms of people doing research, there's research that's in a very good environment where certain things are taken care of. But as you shared with us today, that's not necessarily always the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are many different types of professionals out there. I think one statement that might be applicable to all. So it's already a given statement that computation is important. Yes. But I think it doesn't hurt, no matter where you are, what you're doing, to spend more time either programming or doing math. It may, again, no matter what you do, even for like those hardcore software engineers, learn a new language, right? Understand. So that's one aspect on the programming side. And on the other side of the coin, like understanding how to communicate things using mathematical formulation, that's a different level of abstraction. So like I said, in most places, computer science comes out of math. In some places it comes out of, let's say, engineering, but engineering sometimes could come out of math as well. But the paths are, the ancestry of the academic departments is fun to go through. But no matter what you do, I think that your job function would always be able to be enriched by being able to speak to or benefit from either of those paths or both of those paths.
That's solid advice. And I think it'll just get more and more, I don't want to call it competitive, but the bar will be raised in the future in terms of the base level of technical skill that you may have to have in order to sort of exist in a technological, very, very highly advanced technological economy. Yeah, I said that correct. So last couple of questions. The main reason we do the show is to encourage people from home to leverage some of the things that you've learned from home in the Caribbean region to advance your career and also be a part of the data space. So what would you say around the elements of your Caribbean heritage have helped you navigate your career, if any?
An openness to new cultures and contexts definitely is. And I would say that that's probably rooted in growing up in the Caribbean. And openness to actually engaging with strangers. That's another element that I can say I would probably attribute to that as well. I still have to say the education system in the Caribbean is something that is something that like there's value in it. Like there are people that I've gone to school with. I'm like, you all are amazing. And this is coming from having a foundation that was set in a particular context. So there is value in that. I hope it's still what it was. I definitely know that there are differences when I was in school versus generations before. But I still say that the education system in the Caribbean is something that adds incredible value. I just hope that as a people, we can benefit from it. And then you alluded to this before. My family is one of those families because of this openness to connections. Like there are people in my family who grew up all over, whether it's West Africa, UK, or other Caribbean islands. That notion of being connected and understanding that there is a notion of we. Yes, there is individuality, but you, as an individual, you exist in a context. And that notion of having a we to be a part of is something that I think has been really important and useful for me as a professional. So coming to Kenya, yes, the Jamaicans are definitely loved. Everybody knows Jamaica. And everybody still asks the question, what part of Jamaica is Trinidad in? Yeah. However, Dwight York did us a solid, and at least his time as a footballer in England did at least make some people understand where Trinidad and Tobago is. But in all seriousness, though, the experiences as a person from the Caribbean coming to Africa, where the experience of being in a Commonwealth country, there still are, like, that still means something, right? So beyond having to worry about passports, not having to worry about passports and visas, there's an element of a commonality, of being, of sharing things in common. And sometimes it may even be that some of the people that you're working with here spent time in the UK and knows what different islands are in the Caribbean because that's who their neighbors or that's who their classmates were. So there is value in that, and it has definitely opened doors.
Great. Good to know. And hopefully people listening continue to leverage that network of being from the Caribbean, right? Not only the direct sort of country that you're from. So my last two questions are, what are 3 principles you live by? I've sort of taken a lot of things from the interview, but if you can maybe summarize them, that would be great.
Be open to trying new things. Work hard, and take the opportunity to sit and figure out what works and doesn't work for you. Those are 3 that I would go with. The
last one is good. I think I'm going to do that after this call. There's some things I need to think about. And my last question, what are 3 books that you recommend? You did mention one, Dune, by, yes, I forgot the author.
Frank Herbert.
Frank Herbert, okay.
Yeah. I think in a Caribbean context, I'd also add C.L.R. James's Beyond the Boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And the third, I'd say it's a book that I'm reading now. And actually need to get the citation, but there's a new a math for machine learning book. Again, I'm applying my own recommendations. So there's a book on GitHub, math for machine learning. And what I like about it is that it's actually a crowdsourced activity. Yes, there are authors, and the book is freely available because the authors have actually released the book on GitHub. And the issue board is really a treat because you're seeing discussion that goes into the generation of a textbook. I've never had this particular view of a textbook, and I think that the book has benefited from it.
Wow. And it's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, it is.
That's exciting. Okay, I'll definitely check that one out. I'm gonna go download it now.
So if you Google math for machine learning and GitHub, it should be the first one that comes up.
Perfect. Well, Sekou, once again, appreciate you spending the time with us today. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I'm definitely taking some notes on the future and some things I need to probably rethink after the call. So once again, thank you very much for your time.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.